Are your hip flexors tight? Maybe you've heard about the importance of having good hip mobility, but don't know if you're actually restricted or you don't know where to start. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can actually test your own hip mobility at home to see if you are actually restricted, or I'm going to show you another test to see if your hip flexors may be just weak and you maybe just need to do some strengthening of the hip. And the best exercises to fix those things. Let's get into it. So why is hip mobility so important? So the more mobile we are through our hips, the less we have to move through our low back. Now, just to be clear, it's totally normal and totally okay for you to move your spine, okay? But when we want to, lift something heavy, for example, a box, a child, if we want to do like a deadlift or a squat in the gym, it's very important that we can be very mobile through the hips, keep our lumbar spine neutral and stabilized, and lift with our hips. Or, for example, if we want to run, all right? Running requires a lot of hip extension, okay? If we don't have good hip extension or extension mobility out of our hip, we're gonna have to hyperextend out of our low back and cause extra stress to our low back. So that's why hip mobility is so important. So what are your hip flexors? First, let's go over the main motions that can happen at the hip, okay? First, we have hip flexion, okay? Hip extension, so leg behind. Hip abduction, so leg away from the body. Hip adduction, coming closer to the body. And then we have internal and external rotation at the hip. Now, it's possible to be restricted in any of these motions, but the one that I most commonly find in the clinic is hip extension. The hip flexors flex the hip and are commonly tight in individuals. And the reason being probably because nowadays, more than ever before, we are a sitting population. So the hip flexors are in a shortened position for long periods throughout the day. When we go to stand up and they can get tight, pull on the low back. So that seems to be the most common restriction that I find in the clinic is limited hip extension mobility because the hip flexors are tight and limiting that extension mobility. We don't extend our hips through their full range of motion often enough. And this is why we tend to get tightness in the front of our hips here. So now we're gonna do the Thomas test. This is something that you can do at home to test if your hip flexors are actually tight. Okay, this is a test that we do all the time in the clinic on our patients to test hip mobility. All right, guys, here's how you're gonna test your own hip flexor mobility at home. This is the Thomas test. So ideally, you want to do this on something sturdy. So, a table, a kitchen counter. You can do this off the edge of your bed, but you want your leg to be able to hang off the edge of the bed without touching the floor. You'll see why in a second. So this is our prop table. I hope I don't fall. So what you're going to do is you're going to come and sit on the very edge of your table or what have you, and you're going to hug one knee to your chest and lie back very carefully. And you're gonna hug this knee all the way to your chest. And what we're looking for is what happens to the opposite leg, okay? Now, your hip flexors, again, are the muscles here in the front of your hip, okay? So ideally what we wanna see is we want our thigh to be at least parallel with the edge of the table. Okay, if my thigh is kind of hanging up in the air like this a little bit at all, that indicates tightness in my hip flexors, specifically the iliopsoas muscle, okay? Now make sure you're hugging this knee real tight, okay? If you're letting this one kind of sag down, you're cheating, okay? So make sure you're hugging real tight and then just let this leg relax. Again, we want to see that thigh to be at least parallel with the table, if not hanging down a little bit. Now, the other thing that we want to take a look at is the knee, what's happening to my knee, okay? Because you have two, I'm going to sit up for just a second here. We have two main hip flexors, okay? You have first your iliopsoas muscle that flexes the hip, but you also have a muscle called your rectus femoris quadriceps muscle, okay? One of your quadricep muscles, one of the muscles in the front of your thigh, also works to flex the hip. But it starts here, it flexes the hip, but it also works on the knee. It flexes the knee as well. Okay, so that hip flexor, we want to take a look at what happens to the knee in this position. So as you come back, you're hugging the knee, the leg relaxes down, If my knee stays extended like this and the leg is more straight, the knee's straight, that indicates tightness in the rectus femoris muscle. Okay. Ideally, what we want to see is the knee relaxed to at least to 90 degrees. Okay. So the two things that you're looking for that would kind of fail you on this test are if the thigh's up, hanging in the air like this off the edge of the table or the bed, or if the knee stays extended. That would indicate tightness in either the iliopsoas muscle or the rectus femoris quad muscle. Now, if you found that you were restricted in either your iliopsoas or your rectus femoris muscle, here are the two basic and best stretches to lengthen those guys. Okay, so the first one is the half kneel hip flexor stretch. This one's going to mainly target the iliopsoas muscle. Okay, so you're going to get in this half kneel position, one knee up, one knee down. Make sure you're doing this on a yoga mat, or you can even put a pillow under the knee just to keep the knees comfy. All right, so again, one knee up, one knee down. Okay, and where we want to feel the stretch is in the front of the hip right here. Okay, now the big mistake that almost everybody makes with this stretch is they lean forward like this and they're hyperextending from the low back. Now, that might not necessarily be a bad thing, but it could be if you do have some back pain or discomfort or sensitivity back there. So what we want to do is first what we call a posterior pelvic tilt. So you're going to tuck your tailbone under you like you're a dog who's in trouble and slightly just lean forward. And I already feel a stretch right there. I don't have to come way out here like this, okay? So that's kind of the biggest tip for you there. Make sure you tuck your tailbone and squeeze this butt cheek, all right? And that's gonna stretch the front of the hip. And then if I need to, I can just kind of slightly lean forward to accentuate that stretch. I can hold this stretch for about 30 seconds and do it a couple times on both sides. Make sure you do this on both sides, guys. Make sure you do the test on both sides too. You may, be tighter on one side than you are the other, but I would always recommend doing both sides when you are stretching. If you are more limited on one side versus the other, you could just hold that side for a bit longer or do another set. So maybe 3 sets of 30 seconds on the tighter side. So we'll go ahead and do the other side now. So if you discovered that your rectus femoris quad muscle was the one that was tight, if your knee stayed extended during the Thomas test, this is the test, or excuse me, the stretch that you'd want to try. Now we call this the couch stretch, and you'll see why in a minute. I'm gonna take my shoes off because, no shoes on the couch or the bed, right? Your mom always said that. So they call this the couch stretch because what you're gonna do is you're gonna put one foot up on the couch, just like this, okay? And essentially we're doing the same stretch as before, but the knee is more flexed. This is gonna put that rectus femoris quad muscle more on stretch, okay? And you'll still feel this in the front of your hip here, but you'll feel this especially in the front of your thigh, okay? Again, don't forget to do that posterior pelvic tilt. So you're gonna kind of tuck your tailbone, squeeze this butt cheek to feel the good stretch in the front here, and then you can lean forward a little bit if you need to. So it's important to note, stretching can be a little uncomfortable. You shouldn't be experiencing any pain, but a little bit of discomfort with stretching is normal and okay. So just find a medium stretch. Again, you can hold this for about 30 seconds and make sure you do both sides. Tuck that tailbone and lean forward. So you've done the Thomas test and maybe you weren't tight, but you still always feel like you're maybe tight there. So it's very possible that your hip flexors are just actually weak, okay? Especially if you're like a runner, okay? The hip flexors can be overused, all right, and feel like they're tight all the time, but as far as their length, their position, they're not actually tight, but they could just be weak. So here's how you test to see if your hip flexors are just weak and need some strengthening. So what you're gonna do is hold on to something, table or a wall, and you're gonna hug, again, that knee up to your chest, this time in standing, okay? Now what you're gonna do is you're gonna let go and see what happens to that knee, okay? If you pull that knee up to your chest and you let go and your knee falls like that, that indicates some weakness here, okay? What you wanna see is if you let go, you can hold it, and for at least 5 seconds. I would recommend trying actually to see if you can go for a full 30 seconds, okay? That's gonna really help you see side-to-side differences in strength. So if you discover that you were tight or weak, all right, it's possible that a muscle can be tight and weak. Here's my bonus tip for you, all right? I have found what helps people the very most when they have tightness in this area is what I like to call lengthening under load, okay? So a lot of times we can get tight just because we're not strong in our end ranges, okay? So this is probably one of my very favorite exercises to unlock those hip flexors. Okay, what you're gonna do is you're gonna get back in that test position, lying back carefully. All right, and I've got a handy dandy ankle weight on my ankles here. Now you could use a kettlebell, just kind of hook that kettlebell on the edge of your toes. All right, but what you're gonna do is just kind of go through these repetitions where you're slowly, in a controlled fashion, lowering that leg with a little bit of resistance, okay? That's gonna kind of get a little bit of an accentuated stretch at the bottom, but it's also strengthening that muscle at the same time. I'd recommend trying to find a weight that you could maybe do 15 or 20 reps with and a couple sets on both sides. Okay, that's it for this video. I taught you how to test your own hip flexor mobility. I taught you also how to test if it's just actually weakness. Maybe it feels tight, but it's actually just weak. And I taught you my very favorite exercises to work on those restrictions and limitations. Remember that with good hip mobility, we have to rely less on our low back. I'm always about finding ways to keep my low back healthy long term.